camera. Okay. All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Sara Lundberg and I'm the director of the Arlington Historical Society. And I'm here today to show you our new exhibition called Menotomy Road to Revolution, which was set to open April 19th, 2020. But unfortunately, the pandemic made it so that we couldn't open the exhibition on time, but we hope to open it at some point over the summer. In the meantime, we're going to be showing you a couple of gallery talks with some of the participants that have been involved in the planning of the exhibition. Two of them we have today, and I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourselves, Doris Birmingham and Doreen Stevens, starting with Doreen.
Hi, my name is Doreen Stevens, and I've been actively involved with the Historical Society. It seems like forever. I currently serve on the two board committees, and I also helped with the Road to Revolution exhibit.
Great. And Doris?
Hi, I'm Doris Birmingham. I have been active in the Historical Society for about 12 years. Most of my time has been devoted to the guide program, which I have overseen for most of that time. I am an art historian in background, and I have been involved in researching and planning this exhibition. It's been really great fun for me.
Great, thank you. Okay, bear with me for 1 second while I lock the video. It's probably going to blip away for a second. Oops. Okay. Starting with you, Doreen, and we're going to look at this lovely silhouette that we have. This is just an image of a silhouette that's in the collection. It's quite a bit larger in real life, but we decided to go ahead and make a copy there. This shows Reverend Cook, and he's a figure you've done a lot of research for in the exhibition. Can you tell me a little bit about him and what his background was and his role in Menotomy?
This silhouette is unfortunately the only image we have of Reverend Cook. He is, of course, dressed in regulation 18th century congregational minister garb with the big powdered wig as well, which might look a little odd to modern eyes. He was born in 1709 in Hadley, Massachusetts. He became Arlington's first minister. Arlington then was the Northwest Precinct of Cambridge. In 1739, he served in that role for 44 years until his death in 1783. So he saw and participated in a lot of the events of the very tumultuous 18th century here in Eastern Massachusetts and the Boston area in Arlington. And that, of course, included the beginnings of the American Revolution on April 19th, 1775. I mentioned that he was from Hadley. In the early 1700s, Hadley was the Wild West of Massachusetts. It's still was struggling with Native American relations. There were wars and raids and deaths that were still occurring in the early 1700s. But it was also the home to the Connecticut river gods, who were incredibly wealthy merchants often, who had extraordinary homes and extraordinary amount of wealth. His own family, he descended from Aaron Cook, who was a founder of Northampton, also of several other Connecticut River Valley towns. So very illustrious forebears, but his own family was basically a small farming family, and had the well, we wouldn't consider it misfortune, but for Reverend Cook, it was an unlucky set of circumstances, a family with a great number of daughters, and he was the only son. He was destined for the ministry, but he had to wait until almost at the last minute, a small miracle. His mother gives birth to one other son who, when he was of age, was able to take over the farming duties from Samuel Cook, allowing him to come east to Boston, to Harvard, to begin his studies to become a congregational minister. He graduates from Harvard in 1735, spends several years earning his master's, which sort of prepared you for the minister. The Congregationalists were adamant about having well-educated leaders in their churches, their ministers. And he did the normal things that such students did. He filled in at various area pulpits when ministers were sick or the congregations were in between ministers. He also was a schoolmaster, school teacher at area schools, and he was a tutor in the Royale family in Medford. In 1739, he becomes Menotomy and he found each other. He becomes our first minister, and he spends a year sort of becoming getting comfortable with his role, but also the congregation itself built his first home, which we also have an image of in our collection. And when the home is built and ready, he zips back to Hadley and swoops up his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Porter, who was a member of one of the wealthier Connecticut River Valley Gods family, and brings her back to Menotomy. Unfortunately, a month or so shy of their first anniversary, she gives birth to a child who dies, and she in turn dies. So Reverend Cook is a widower after this very brief marriage. He spends a year or so recovering, and then he marries into the very important Cotton dynasty of ministers in Boston area, Anna Cotton of Newton. And she and Reverend Cook have 11 children, 4 of whom die very young from the various scourges, the waves of diseases that would sweep through all of the colonies in that era throughout the whole world. We're very, I think, more poignantly aware of the effects of such infectious diseases, which the medicine of the time had no answers for. So it's very sad, his entries in, he was our town record keeper. So in addition to keeping track of the births and marriages and deaths of his entire congregation, he's including his own family, and he made some notes in his records that are evidence of the pain those deaths caused him and his family. Then we come to maybe his most eventful marriage in terms of the exhibit and our theme, the Road to Revolution. In 1762, he marries Anna Cotton. He marries Lucy Bowes, who was the widow of Nicholas Bowes of Bedford, but she's also the daughter of Bishop Hancock of Lexington. Bishop's an honorific title. The Congregationists did not have bishops in their congregations. He was just very well respected, so it was an honorary nickname. And Bishop Hancock's, one of his other children, gave birth to John Hancock, the John Hancock of Revolutionary fame, and the one who signed his name very large at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence. And because of his father's death, John Hancock spends much of his childhood in Lexington, and that is his family. So as an adult, when he's living in Boston, he often comes by coach out to his own coach. I mean, it was a very momentous, noticeable retinue when he came for his visits to the small country town of either Menotomy or Lexington. And he visits his aunt and uncle in Menotomy at the parsonage, and then he goes on to visit Jonas Clark and his wife in their parsonage, because Jonas Clark marries Lucy Hancock Bowes Cook's daughter. So the familial connections are getting pretty interlaced here. Reverend Cook actually married Jonas Clark and his wife, and Jonas Clark, Reverend Cook served as a mentor to the younger minister, to Jonas Clark. And if we have one of our most prized documents in our collection is a letter from Jonas Clark's daughter that describes the events of April 19th in the Lexington parsonage. And she notes that one of the first things that Jonas Clark does after the mayhem and the horrors and the ravages of April 19th is to send one of his children to Menotomy to check and make sure that grandfather Cook is okay. So there are connections that are familiar, tightly enlacing these two families, these three families, including John Hancock of Boston. But it's also the case that the implications are that these two ministers, both of them are strong patriots, and in their sermons, they're proclaiming the patriot version of the world that John Hancock and his cronies, Samuel Adams et al., are purporting or are holding forth on in Boston in political terms, in the political fray. So there is definitely the road to revolution includes the pulpits of the ministers in Lexington and in Menotomy, and the familial and collegial connections and the road to revolution tightly connect these two parishes.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. And here we have the wine glass that was used in the ordination of Reverend Cook in 1739. Can you tell me a little bit more about this?
This is one of the happiest items in our exhibit. It is to honor the ordination of Reverend Samuel Cook as the first minister in Menotomy, also formerly the Northwest Precinct of Cambridge, and eventually to become Arlington. And just as we most recently and avidly watched the inauguration of a new president, the ordination ceremonies for congregational ministers in a state which still had a state-supported religion, which is what congregational religion was in Massachusetts, that there's a direct connection between the way we celebrate and honor and have the rituals around a new president in our country and the way the Congregationalists celebrated the arrival of a new minister. It was a sort of formal ritual that formally announced to the larger world that this congregation was together and organized and had a leader. And for poor Menotomy, it spent 10 years between 1732, when they finally got their precinctship okayed by the general court, the legislature, and then they got the meeting house built, and then they had to search and search and search for a minister. 4 or 5 different candidates rejected them. So finally, when they could connect up with Reverend Cook, when they could gather and agree on a covenant, which was so important for congregational members, what they all signed on to control or to organize their relationship to God and to each other within this small piece of territory. When they did that, and it had arrived at all this great turmoil and trouble, then there is a warrant article that is sent to all the voters in the Menotomy area to vote on, should we have an ordination event? How much do we spend? We need a committee to get all the details, logistics together, and we have to tax ourselves to pay for it. And so it was a big deal. They did all of that. They had the ceremony. They had all the visiting. They had 4 or 5 different visiting ministers give important sermons, charging this new minister and essentially laying on of hands that he was now a member of their community as well as of Menotomy's. And then it was party time, and they would have a big feast and sometimes dancing. And we don't know that happened in Menotomy, but it did happen in other congregations, and lots of wine. Food and wine.
Great, awesome. Here we have one of many Samuel Cook sermons that are in our collection. What kinds of subjects did Cook speak about to his congregation? And specifically, how did he use the pulpit to advocate for political causes?
As I mentioned, in 44 years, 2 sermons a day, maybe 1 midweek, in addition to all of the special sermons that were given, Reverend Cook gave a lot of words came out of his mouth that were directed to leading his congregation. His sermons, it's wonderful. We have this treasure trove of Reverend Cook's sermons that were carefully saved as the treasures that they are, but they're nearly impossible for modern eyes to read. It's like decoding. It's like, you know, we need the Hammurabi stone or something to be able to do it more easily. It's I've spent a lot of hours and it's quite a task, but luckily there earlier historians have been able to decipher, decode many of his sermons. So we have snippets of them that are in earlier histories of Arlington. And we also have many of them were printed. It's hard, it's probably impossible for us to think that you would avidly pick up the latest sermon that was printed when you were at the neighborhood pub or tavern to read. But it was sort of like, it wasn't like the People magazine in the dentist office, but they were avidly devoured by people throughout Massachusetts, particularly other congregational ministers. Say you're a minister out there in the, you know, the wild west of Massachusetts, and finally you get hold of a sermon that's been printed in Boston. It was, you know, part of the intellectual milieu. You wanted to know what the world of ideas was coming up with. So sermons were printed and they were read, and several of sermons that Reverend Cook gave for other ministers' ordinations. He gave an important sermon to the Artillery Day sermon to the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. He gave the Dudleyan lecture at Harvard, which was sort of a more intellectual exercise. It wouldn't have been probably as interesting. It wouldn't be interesting to us probably at all, but it was sort of a plum gig to be asked to give that particular sermon. And he gave endless, he would trade pulpits with other ministers. That was a common thing to do, give a little bit of relief. You could reuse one of your older sermons. But most importantly, and the sermon that I'd like us to think about for a minute that was undeniably of undeniable importance at the time. It was an undeniable importance to the revolutionary cause in the 1770s, and it still resonates today. It's a sermon that's often spoken about, mentioned, or sometimes included in modern day histories. And that was the Election Day sermon of May 1770. And 1770 was, of course, just a month or so after the Boston Massacre, which was like an explosion in the timeline if we're looking at the causes for the American Revolution. And partly as a result of that event, the Election Day itself, which was the occasion for the sermon, the day when the General Court, which is what our Massachusetts legislature is called, congregated and met to start to grapple with political issues. It's gathering in Cambridge, which is not the normal place at all, but feelings were running so high because of the massacre that it had to be moved to Cambridge, or I'm sorry, it was decreed to be moved by the royal government, which was a cause célèbre to the Patriots. And it's in Cambridge. It's to the congregation in quotes, included the legislators of the General Court. It also included the council, who were sort of akin to maybe the way we think about the Senate. They were usually royalists. They were wealthier merchants, generally pro-government. We had a royal governor at the time. And to Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, who was about to be Governor Hutchinson, who was allied, of course, with the council and with the royalist side view of the world in 1770. So Reverend Cook is giving this sermon to these very, very important people. And they're people he knew. I mean, he knew Samuel Adams, he knew John Hancock, he knew Hutchinson, he knew Isaac Royale, he knew all of these people from various meetings that he attended and from personal connections. And he gives a sermon that is considered to be one of the most erudite and learned and brilliant concision of all things having to do with the Enlightenment and with congregational thought. So it's sort of as if John Locke meets John Winthrop, and Reverend Cook distilled that all down for his listeners. He talked about natural rights, about the separation of powers, about the need for honorable leadership, and the fact that the leader was just another man among many. He did all of those things with sort of regulation. You know, Thomas Jefferson would have recognized all of those thoughts immediately. But at the end of his talk, he gives of his sermon on Election Day, 1770. He has one, these were all known things, the ideas that he distilled into his Election Day sermon. It's not as if these were new ideas and he's coming up with them. He has one new idea that is presented that I think is, I'm just always, it is was of importance then, unfortunately wasn't listened to. And its effects are with us all too notably today. And that was, he asked for the elimination of the slave trade. Reverend Cook had American slaves in his congregation. He married them, he buried them. They were in the gallery in his meeting house every Sunday. There were maybe 10 to 12 enslaved Americans in Menotomy in the 1770s, down a bit from an earlier decades. And he noted in his in the 1740s, he noted in his diary, it's one of the saddest things when I read it in histories of Arlington, that Caesar Cutter hanged himself. And Caesar Cutter was, his surname Cutter was indicated he was an enslaved American in the Cutter family. And Caesar, of course, was one of those obnoxious sort of pet dog names that slave owners gave to their slaves. So he knew, he'd been in the Royale House for a year or two when he was tutoring Isaac Royale, and the Royale House had the largest extent. They today have the largest extent slave quarters, but they had the largest number of slaves in the colonies. So he knew, I think, in a way that we can identify with what slavery did to people. So that is an important part of that particular sermon.
Excellent, thank you. So now we're just going to conclude by making a quick jog over to this section of the exhibit, which kind of mirrors the other side and shows, it not only shows the parsonage as it appeared when photography was invented, Cook's parsonage, which was just destroyed by fire in 1881, but also a shutter from his house. This is an interior shutter that would protect your windows. It has some of the battle damage from the fighting in 1775. And it's that fighting that we're going to focus on now, especially illustrating the family of Deacon Joseph Adams and Hannah Hall Adams, and to Doris. Now, can you tell us who Deacon Adams was and specifically what a deacon is? I think a lot of people might like to have that answered. Doris?
Okay, Deacon Adams was born in 1715 and died in 1794. He was chosen as deacon of the parish church in 1759. Before that, he was already very prominent in the community as a precinct selectman, and he held various precinct offices for several terms. So he was a very important person in the community, and perhaps that was one of the reasons that the minister, Reverend Cook, chose him to be a deacon. Now, many of the churches had two deacons. There were two deacons during Deacon Adams' time, but he was nominated by the minister, approved by the congregation, and then ordained. And these deacons usually took a prominent role in just the Sunday services. There was usually a special dais with their chairs where they could be seen by the rest of the congregation. In some cases, but I think we don't know that it's the case here in Menotomy, they even had special collars and special bonnets to distinguish them. So this was an extremely important and very highly honored position. And well, what were his duties? There were quite a few, but among them, the most important ones were overseeing church finances, providing for the poor, and standing in for the minister if he was unable to conduct a service some Sunday morning. But perhaps the most solemn duty of a deacon was to care for and protect the communion service, which included the plates, drinking vessels, and linens used in celebrating the sacrament, which was done about once a month in the local parish churches. So Deacon Adams, before we say more about his role here, is to talk a little about his family, because his family were very much part of the scene on April 19th. He had, first of all, he'd had two wives. By the time the revolution came along, his first wife had died, and he was married to Hannah. And Hannah had only recently given birth to a baby, a daughter named Anne. Besides baby Anne, there were 13 other children who had been born to the Deacon Adams. And out of the total of 14, 13 survived to adulthood, which was very rare. And certainly Deacon Adams was more fortunate than Reverend Cook in his children's longevity. Anyway, what we're seeing here is a group of objects that all have some relationship to events of April 19th, 1775. There is a reproduction copy against the back wall of the clock that was destroyed, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, on April 19th. There is a blanket chest, and on top of the blanket chest is a silver tankard and a Bible. And then on the floor is a cradle, which is said to be the cradle that the baby slept in, although she wasn't in the cradle at the time of the British entry into the house, but seemingly in her mother's arms, which we can quite well understand. So what had happened is that in the early morning, after the British marched into Lexington, a neighbor approached the Deacon Adams and told him that he would be wise to hide, since his name and also his probably distant relationship with Samuel Adams, the fiery patriot. And so despite, I'm certain, his worries about the fate of his family, he opted to leave the house and leave them behind alone, thinking probably that the British would never hurt a mother and childbed and what was maybe 6 or 7 of his younger children who were still home. He had older children too, but they apparently were not in the house. They were in the fields or elsewhere when all of this occurred. So he left the family home, assuming no harm would come, but he was wrong. And this display helps to tell the story of the frightening things that happened. Essentially, the Adams family experienced what today we would call a home invasion. At least 3 British soldiers burst into the house and began to rifle through all of the various possessions, taking whatever they could, wrapping it in bed sheets, which they found hanging on the line, and other objects along the way, which really reflects the violence and plundering of the British troops on their way back to Boston after the events in Concord and Lexington. First, they rampaged through the entire house. Then they ripped out the brass works of what must have been the family's most prized possession, the tall clock that we can see in the background here. This clock is of either English or American uh, manufacture. It had to be an extremely expensive item because it is japanned. You can see on the front of the case this gold and black imagery, which is done in a technique called japanning, which was inspired by Chinese enamel painting. American japanning was not done by the same techniques as the Chinese used, but it made for a pretty good imitation of Chinese work. And it would have been the kind of object that would have only been found in wealthier homes. And probably Joseph Adams was well enough off that he could afford this item. And maybe because it was so precious, or maybe because they wanted to make it a remembrance of events of April 19th, it was saved by the family, even though its entire interior works had been ripped out and taken to Boston by British soldiers, probably melted down to make some other items that the British Army needed. The other item that's of particular importance is the chest, the old wooden chest. And this wooden chest was a very special thing because this is where the Reverend Adams the Deacon Adams kept the communion items that he was responsible for caring for: the silver, the pewter, the linens, and the contribution money that came about every Sunday. When the British came into Mrs. Adams' bedroom, they first threatened her with their guns and bayonets. She said in her sworn testimony that they pointed the bayonet at her chest and threatened to kill her, but that one of the other officers in the group had stopped this thing from happening. And it ended up that the soldiers just ordered her out of the house. She was still only 2 weeks beyond having given birth to baby Anne. So she was weak. And she says that she wrapped herself in a blanket and went out into the corn bin with the baby and waited out events. Meanwhile, she had left behind her little children. I guess all of them might have been hiding under her bed, and they were there quietly, unnoticed, until the soldiers attacked this blanket chest and broke the lock and found inside all of the communion articles. And when they started to rifle through them, one of the children, the 9-year-old child, couldn't stand it. And he screamed out, "You get out of there, or my dad's going to whoop you." This didn't bother the soldiers at all. They just continued their merry way with stealing and taking whatever they could. And among the things that they took is the silver tankard that we see in the case on top of the chest. This is an interesting item, and it has a kind of unhappy history because it originally was made as a tankard. And sometime in the 19th century, it was modified to make it into a pitcher. And they think that this was probably the result of changing practices in the church for communion services, during which people, instead of drinking directly from a tankard, would drink from a smaller cup. And that this tankard was turned into a pitcher so that it could be used to pour wine into these much less massive receptacles.
They would have looked like this, right? Something like this would be what a set
Yeah.
would look before.
Yeah, the tankards here are a different style than our tankard. They have bulbous bottoms, and ours has a straight contour. There's some question about who made this tankard. It's kind of an interesting problem. It was thought for a long time that it was made by Thomas Edwards, who was one of the most prominent silversmiths in Boston. There is a mark on it, but the mark is hard to distinguish. It could be either the mark of Thomas Edwards or of his nephew Joseph. And I tend to think that it was probably made by Joseph Edwards because of its date. Its date is about 1769. And Joseph Edwards was quite alive and active in 1769, while his uncle Thomas had died in 1755. So 1769 was the year that is given in the inscription. And so probably it's Joseph. And he was also the maker of quite a lot of other tankards, at least two of which are known, one in Yale and one in the Minnesota Museum of Art. The tankard then, of course, was a tankard, and it was taken by the British to Boston and thought to be probably forever lost. But the British hawked it, fortunately, instead of melting it down. And a pawnbroker in Boston recognized it as belonging to the church, contacted the church, and the deacon went to Boston and redeemed it, it said, with his own money. So good guy. I'm not so sure he was such a good guy to leave his wife and children at home, but at least he was generous about hawking, about redeeming the silver. The entire losses suffered in the Adams house, which included this communion vessel and the other communion ware, which was almost certainly only pewter, but all of the losses, according to the testimony of Joseph Adams, amounted to a little over 17 British pounds, which, depending on how you figure it, might have been something like $2,500 in today's money. So that includes not only the silver tankard, but everything else. What happened then to the house and the soldiers and the children and Mrs. Adams? Well, the soldiers wrapped everything up and hauled it off. Before they left the house, they tried to set it on fire with some meager kindling of some sort. The children, thinking quickly, jumped to its rescue and put out the fire with the aid of a barrel of beer and a barrel of water. It's a wonderful combination, and it must have been a heroic act that I hope that the deacon and his wife rewarded the children for somehow or another. At any rate, the tankard itself, as I said, was pawned and redeemed, and it was ultimately kept in what is now the Universalist Unitarian Church. It still belongs to them, but they have very generously loaned it to this exhibition, and we're very grateful for that.
Great, thank you. I just want to point out one little thing too, just because it's interesting, at least to me, is that the Adams house is still standing at today's 35 Bailey Road. It's the rear addition onto this mansard roof house. So this portion is that house, which is a very old gambrel roof style. Oh,
But
So,
it would not have been on Bailey Road at that time. It was
yeah.
actually just down the street, perhaps across the street. The latest thing I've read, perhaps across the street, somewhere near what is now the Whole Foods store.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. For those who are watching, if you haven't gotten a chance to watch the video where I will do a full walkthrough of the entire exhibit with Robert Gross, please take a moment to watch that video as well. And I really appreciate Doris and Doreen for all of their work on this exhibit and the extra research especially that we're able to share with you today. So thank you both so much, and we will see you soon.
Welcome.
Bye. Okay.